My name is Marvin Rappaport, and I'm pleased to be here to conduct an interview with Rubin Katz, Ruby Katz as he is known, who's been a resident, a lifelong resident of the area in Sullivan County, in Monticello, which has been the heart and soul of the Catskills resort area, the Borscht Belt. The project we're working on is largely known as StoryCorps, where we record stories of individuals, an oral history project, and we try to capture the history and the flavor of the community in which we live. Our Catskills have a unique history, and we're pleased to interview Ruby Katz today to discuss his background, his history, and some of the things that he knows about the community that perhaps nobody else remembers or knows. I'm pleased to be joined by Alan Barrish, for 25 years the director of the Ethelbert B. Crawford Public Library, where we are conducting this interview and under whose auspices we are doing this program. So welcome to the microphone, welcome to this oral history project, Ruby, and please tell us what year you were born and when you came to Sullivan County if you weren't born here.
Okay. Thank you for selecting me for this interview. I appreciate it. I was born in West Brookville, New York. That's near Wurtsboro, Sullivan County, New York, on May the 12th, 1923. Started...
Family was involved in business here?
My family had a very small farm on the south side of the Basher Kill with 5 cows and a kochalane, which we call a facility where people came and did their own cooking.
Right. It's a Yiddish term, means cook alone.
Cook alone.
Right. So there would be a unit where people could actually have a little apartment, as it were.
And times were very difficult. My father couldn't make a living, so he had to go back to New York City to work as a painter. Apparently, that made me very unhappy, and I cried day and night to go back to the country. My father then found a small farm in Glenwild, New York, which he purchased from a man by the name of Percy Bowers by putting down 50 cents as a down payment and a mortgage of $1,500 for the balance, which was not paid in full till the Second World War. My father worked 7 days a week, painting in hotels, prisons, any place that he could work. Mostly his pay was $1 a day.
Could you tell us roughly how many hotels there were? This is the 30s we're talking about?
Yes.
How many hotels roughly were there at that time?
There were hundreds of small hotels and small bungalow colonies and what we called rooming houses, which were for summer people to rent a room, share a kitchen and a dining room. Each facility, most of them had their own little grocery store for servicing their own few people. There were hundreds of small rooming houses, small hotels, as well as a handful of major hotels. As the years progressed, the major hotels grew larger. The smaller places fell by the wayside slowly, not all at once. In those days, most of the people who came to the mountains came primarily for the fresh air, the good water. A lot of them felt that the air was good for an illness called something to do with the lungs. Tuberculosis. TB.
Mostly from the New York City area, Jewish families?
Mostly, entirely Jew. Well, no, there were Italian families also, which I'm not too familiar with. There were segregated areas in Sullivan County in those days where I can specifically remember signs would say, "No Jews allowed," or "The Christian Paradise," Smallwood, "The Christian Paradise." That was a sign on Route 17B near White Lake, New York. It's on my mind. I can see it many days of my life.
Where in Glenwild did you grow up?
The road was between Rock Hill and Woodridge. Halfway between Rock Hill and Woodridge was a small community called Glenwild. It had 2 or 3 hotels, maybe 4 or 5. Rosenblatt's Hotel, Grand Mountain Hotel, some smaller hotels, Frederick's, mostly some bungalow colonies catering to Jewish clientele. Each family would have a 2-burner gas stove for themselves, 1 table in a master dining room, and shared space in a large refrigerator for sometimes 30 or 40 families in these rooming houses.
1 bathroom?
Well, sometimes 2 bathrooms on a floor. Most of the buildings were 3 stories high, 2 stories high, no elevators, no airplanes, no air conditioning, but good, healthy, fresh air, good, healthy drinking water, and a lot of physical activities. Baseball, basketball, soccer, running, playing, swimming. Most of the small places did eventually put in swimming pools. A lot of them didn't have the swimming pools to start with.
Swam in the local streams, no doubt.
Yes, in the Neversink River. We would take carloads of children in a buggy, horse and buggy, and take them to the Neversink River so that they could swim and then bring them back. I started in a 1-room schoolhouse in Haven, New York, on Route 209, without the ability to speak or understand English.
Because your native tongue was?
My native tongue was Jewish.
Yiddish,
and that was the only language that I could understand or speak. So when I started school in this 1-room schoolhouse with 8 classes, there was a Jewish girl who interpreted what I said in answer to what the teacher's question was to me. If I answered a question correctly, sometimes I would skip a year so that I could graduate earlier. From there, I went to school in a one-room schoolhouse in Glenwild, New York, then to a school in Woodridge, New York for the 7th and 8th grade. From there to the Monticello Central School in Monticello, taken to school by a private car which had 4 or 5 children being transported from Glenwild to the school.
What year did you graduate high school?
I graduated in 1940 from Monticello High School.
Roughly how many were in your class?
I don't remember. I do have a yearbook at home.
Mm-hmm.
Probably...
Dozens, not hundreds.
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Probably 30 or 40.
Really? That's awesome.
At that time, I was drafted into the service for the Second World War. It was 1942 or 3, I think.
And the war was raging at that time.
Right. Discharged in 1945. Came home and went to work for a farmer by the name of Abe Jaffe, Jaffe's Poultry Farm in Glenwild, New York. My job was 7 days a week, 7 in the morning till 7 at night, $10 a week, which included breakfast every day. From there, I was entertaining myself in a tavern in Monticello, New York called Rourke's Tavern on Landfield Avenue, drinking a glass of beer, which was a lot of people who were in the Second World War smoked cigarettes and drank beer in those days. And a man was sitting next to me by the name of Jack Taylor. And he said, "You seem to be a pretty nice guy." He said, "Would you like to buy half of a newspaper?" I said, the only newspaper I'd ever seen in my life was the Daily News and the New York Daily Mirror. And I said, "I don't have any money. I just got out of the service and I have no money whatsoever." He said, "You don't need money. My mother will finance you."
What newspaper was that?
That was the Bulletin Sentinel newspaper, published in Monticello, New York.
Could you tell us what other newspapers, what other local papers around that time in the early 40s? Because
Yes.
I know there were several.
There was, the main newspaper at that time was the Republican Watchman. There was also the Hurleyville Sentinel. There was also the Sullivan County Evening News and the Liberty News, the Liberty Register, the Jeffersonville newspaper, Callicoon newspaper. There were many weekly newspapers at that time. I did enter into the newspaper business with no knowledge of publishing, no knowledge of printing, but it was necessary for me to learn. My partner was Jack Taylor. His mother apparently felt that he needed someone as a partner for him. He was a linotype operator, and we also had a printing business besides the weekly newspaper. Did a lot of printing for small hotels. Main customers, Kutcher's Country Club, Ellenville Hotel,
Tamarack, Neverly.
the
Fallsview.
Fallsview
Yeah.
Hotel.
Where was the plant and or your office at that time?
At one block in on Landfield Avenue. It was the first building on the corner of Landfield and Broadway. We had a small office in that building. My landlord was Judge Cook. The rent was $40 a month, which Mr. Cook came the first of every month to collect. We had 5 employees full-time and many part-time workers who wrote columns for various parts of the county.
How much was the paper on the newsstand?
5 cents. And a subscription by the year was $2 for a whole year, 52 issues. We did a lot of printing for the resort industry.
For example, what would you print? The menus for the dining rooms or
Menus,
flyers?
letterheads, envelopes, flyers, all kinds of stationery. There were other people who did color brochures and advertising, which we did not do. We didn't have the facilities to do that. I'm leaving out a pretty large portion of being a chicken farmer, being a carpenter for many years with the Couch brothers, building lots of duplex bungalows, all in the process of living in Sullivan County to make a living. And
Did the newspaper have a political leaning? I know in those days.
yes. The Bulletin Sentinel was predominantly Democratic leaning. There were a lot of newspapers that were politically connected to the Republicans and to the Democrats, and you received certain legal notices and certain perks that you would receive from being affiliated with that with the Republicans or the Democrats. Sometimes you could get legal notices from both sides if the court wanted them to insert the legal notices in 2 newspapers or something of that nature.
Ruby, now you're talking about post-war when there was really a boom in the
Yes.
Catskills. The boys came home, as they say, from the war. Families began to vacation more. There was more prosperity. How did the county change from that sleepy community that you grew up in to what became a major resort community with, as you said, virtually hundreds of resorts? What was the difference between the summer and the winter?
Yeah. Well, what actually happened, Marvin, in my recollection, my memory, people in New York City worked in factories. They worked long hours. Women predominantly did not work. Women were housewives. Most of the families that came to vacation in the Sullivan County Catskills were of Jewish faith. Most of the families had 2 children, husband and wife. Husband worked in New York City, came up for weekends. The wife and children stayed at the resort for the entire summer. The area grew with the influx of the railroad, the O&W Railroad, which brought thousands of people to Sullivan County. The roads were 2-lane, difficult to travel. Automobiles were not as safe as they are today. Couldn't take the trips. It was a tough time, but people loved the mountains, the fresh air, the freedom of being outside. And there's no doubt in my mind that the climate has changed up here. The winters were very severe, more so than they are today. Of course, we do have different heating systems. When I was living in Sullivan County, most houses were heated by a wood stove. If anyone had some extra money, they could buy a little coal, if they were fortunate enough to have money to buy coal. Most people did not. They cut wood. My father would say, "Ruby, you want to stay warm? Go cut wood." We took 1 bath in the middle of the winter. My mother would heat the water on the stove, and my sister would take a bath, and then I would take a bath in the same water 1 time in the winter. We didn't need any closets for clothes because we didn't have any clothes. We wore the same clothes each day. Our clothes were hung on a nail. Took off your clothes, hung it on a nail, woke up, put the same clothes on. Most of the clothes was hand-me-downs from relatives from New York who was generally better off than we were. The mountains were absolutely great in those years. There were just every summer jobs for young men who earned enough money to pay for their education, colleges. They all came up here and worked in the hotels, worked on farms. I think what started the downfall was air conditioning, airplanes and travel, and women going to work full-time. Of course, this was gradual. It didn't happen overnight. A lot of people didn't see it coming, but gradually it took effect. People were anxious to see the world where they never had the wherewithal to do that before. Times were good. People were making more money than they ever did in their life. Cars were better. Transportation was better. The railroad had faltered and gone out of business. The area changed slowly. There were many, many farms in Sullivan County, many chicken farms, many dairy farms. I don't know how many are left, probably 2 or 3 here or there, not very many. I think that's unfortunate.
How long did your farm last? Did your parents keep farming?
Well, till at the end of the Second World War, we did have a chicken farm, and we did raise chickens, and we would send eggs to New York City. I can't remember the years exactly, but there were a lot of chicken farms at one period of time. I would guess shortly after the Second World War was the heyday for the chicken farm business. It was the Intercounty Farmers Co-op who served as the feed supply for that industry, and the dairy industry also. A very large business in Woodridge, New York. That was a cooperative venture, very successful. What happened to Sullivan County? I can't put my finger on it, but it deteriorated, I believe, because of the airplane and the different ways that people were starting to live.
Let me ask this question. You've kind of brought us full cycle from your beginnings, the farm, the community, and then how slowly things began to go downhill. But you had a window on Broadway, as it were, a window on the world of Sullivan County, being a newspaper man, covering the various events. The 50s and arguably into the 60s were certainly, one would say, the heyday.
The heyday.
The hotels were full. I know from my own family, from Memorial Day to Labor Day, the places normally were full. What did that mean to Broadway and the Main Street in terms of the summer? And what, if any, so let's start with that, and then I want to ask you about any sort of political issues or any major developments in the community over the years that you witnessed or reported on. So we're in the 50s and the 60s and everything is booming. What did it look like, your window on Broadway itself? We know that, for example, to go just through Broadway in the summer could take a half hour, 2 stoplights notwithstanding. What was your perception of the heyday of the Catskills in the 50s and 60s from where you sat?
Every community. Monticello was probably the leading community in Sullivan County. I would say Liberty, New York was probably second. Fallsburg, Woodridge, Hurleyville, Swan Lake, all of the communities in the eastern part of Sullivan County were full of businesses, small businesses, full of summer people who would do business in all of these stores, restaurants, bars and grills. The villages were packed with summer people. The streets were full of people. The stores would stay open till 2, 3, 4 o'clock in the morning during the summertime. The winter, some stores closed, but most of them would stay open year-round.
There's a perception that you needed to have a good season in order to make it through the winter, the quiet time when business was less. Is that accurate? Most of the businesses here had to make
most of the money was made in the summer season. That's absolutely true. They could never survive through the winter if they didn't have the summer business, which was created predominantly with New York City people who came here for vacation. Each community was thriving in the summer in those heydays, thriving with nightclubs, entertainment, restaurants, stores of all types. It was a great time in the history of Sullivan County. We'll never see it again, unfortunately.
What about politics and government and so forth? There was a time when there were stories about New York City gangsters, as it were, who came up here, and they found some of them, in the various lakes many years later when there were these gang wars. But what about the local culture here in the winter? What was the biggest story you covered, or one of the biggest, or two of the biggest stories?
The main thing that I remember about Sullivan County was that each community had its own politicians and political people who I believe were deeply concerned for the well-being of their communities, where I'm not so sure that that's true in this day and age anymore. It seems to me that a lot of politicians have made it a full-time position for a life of their own, and that they're not as concerned with the overall community as they used to when it was mostly part-time employment, and where they truly tried to do what was best for the community. We did have a reputation of gangsters coming to Sullivan County, and there are many, many stories that our Sullivan County historian, John Conway, knows a lot more about it than I do. But one little story that I would like to relate to you was in the village of Monticello. The mayor at that time was a man by the name of Louis DeHoyes Jr., and the head of the Democratic Party at that time was a lady by the name of Rose Rosen, from a law firm, Rosen and Rosen, in Monticello, New York. Mr. DeHoyes,
one being a Republican and the other being a Democrat.
Mr. DeHoyes was the Republican and Rosen was the Democrat. Mr. DeHoyes had a cartoonist draw a cartoon of all the elected Democratic elected officials running in a circle around Rose Rosen, who was in the center of a merry-go-round. And it said, "Ring around the Rosie." And I never forgot that cartoon, because the elected officials were all running around the ring and Rosie Rosen was in the middle. I love that cartoon. I don't have a copy of it anymore, but I wish I did.
Did you run it in your paper?
Of course, because we got paid for running it. It was a paid political ad, and we did run it.
Weren't many of the state and national politicians coming through the Catskills, especially in the summer? The state, the governor, and so forth, or the mayor?
Yes. when I was in the newspaper business, I was invited to 3 different governors' luncheons. One was Governor Pataki, one was Governor Averill Harriman, and the other was Rockefeller. 3 governors would invite usually Fred Stabbert from the Sullivan County Democrat. He was in the western part of the county, and I, at that time, had control of all of the weekly newspapers in the eastern part of Sullivan County. I had bought the Evening News, the Liberty News, the Sullivan County Democrat, excuse me. Hurleyville Sentinel,
right,
and the Republican Watchman, so that I was then the only weekly newspaper left for this part of Sullivan County, which I sold to a subsidiary of the American Greeting Card Company from Cleveland, Ohio, in 1993.
And how long did they run the paper?
They, for some reason, they took over and immediately sold my printing press. I don't know why. They had a central printing plant in Nanuet, New York. They bought a lot of weekly newspapers throughout the eastern part of the United States. They lasted about 3 years. Their philosophies were entirely different from small town publishing. They didn't believe in waiting to collect money, like we knew that we would have to wait till summer for many of our accounts receivable from hotels, which would pay twice or 3 times in the summertime, and then buy all year long with not paying at all. They didn't believe that philosophy would sustain a business, and they said no, they would only give 30 days credit, and I told them they're going to lose most of their accounts. And of course, Milt Kutcher immediately said, if you don't give me credit, he says, I won't do business with you. And
so after you had been in business for decades, a conglomerate came in and closed up in 3 years.
3 years.
So we have about 5 minutes left, Ruby. We're talking with Ruby Katz about his background in history in Sullivan County. What are the things that you talk to your grandchildren about, as it were, children or grandchildren, that most meaningful thing to you about growing up here in Sullivan County, and in particular as it relates to the resort nature?
Well, I'm very fortunate in that I married a very nice, honorable woman by the name of Barbara Brakey, who became Barbara Brakey Katz. We had 2 children, a daughter, Dr. Valerie Katz, a son, Dr. Randolph Katz. My daughter is a chief of surgery in Lincoln Hospital in New York City. My son is a dentist in the village of Monticello. Both were brought up from the time they were 5 years old to work. My children were put to work in my newspaper plant to collate newspapers. I put them on boxes so that they could stand up and work. From the time they were 5 years old, we gave them a good house, a good mother, a good place to live, but they had to work to earn their keep. They had to clean their own room, and their mother was severe with their studies, both becoming very successful, both graduating from Cornell University. And we're very proud of our children. My son still has a practice in the village of Monticello with a very good reputation, I believe.
You mentioned Barbara Brakey, of course, Dr. Brakey.
Dr. Brakey.
We hadn't mentioned as one of the real famous
I should have mentioned Dr. Brakey.
We have time, and would you just tell us a sentence or two about Dr. Brakey and his history in the community?
Dr. Brakey was what they call an old-time doctor who made house calls, whether he got paid for it or not. I will also tell you that when Dr. Brakey died, my wife said that the lawyer who was handling the estate wanted to sue all the people who owed Dr. Brakey money. And my wife came home and she was crying. And I said to Barbara, bring me the accounts receivable. And she did. And I never looked at them, but I burned them up. And the lawyer said, where are the accounts receivable? And I said, there are none.
That's terrific. It's very much a reflection of what life was like in this small community. And it's a wonderful story. And we appreciate your taking the time to share with us your family's history and story today.
Thank you. I'm left out an awful lot, I know.
I'm sure there's so much more in there.
Perhaps we'll sit again and do another version, another chapter, as it were. We thank you. This is Ruby Katz, who has been a lifelong resident of Sullivan County, a newspaper man, a local businessman for many, many years. We thank you for spending time with us today and for sharing your stories about Sullivan County.
And I thank you both for having me.